For 300 years, the Shadowvale Forest killed every outcast thrown into its depths. The pack used it as a death sentence. When they banished Ilara, a rejected Omega, they expected her to be just another corpse. They were wrong. She didn't die. The ancient, primordial wolves that guard the forest didn't tear her apart. They bowed. And 3 days later, she walked out with an army at her back. Ilara was an Omega, an orphan with no status, considered utterly worthless by her own pack. Her only crime was existing. Their punishment was the forest, a certain and gruesome death. But the real question isn't how she survived the impossible. It's why, after centuries of merciless slaughter, the primordial guardians of the Shadowvale chose, for the first time, to kneel. And what they showed her in the dark would shatter the kingdom. The Shadowvale wasn't just a forest. It was the kingdom's original sin, a living boundary drawn in blood 3 centuries ago. The story taught to every child was simple. The first king, Aldrich, betrayed the ancient wolf spirits who helped him win his throne. In his pride, he tried to enslave them. Their vengeance was the Shadowvale, a cursed wood that would forever mark the edge of his domain and kill any of his bloodline, any Omega, who entered. But that official history was a lie. The truth was far more brutal. The forest didn't kill out of mindless curse. It executed a sentence. It was the prison guard for a betrayal so profound, the kingdom had erased it from all but the oldest texts. Our kingdom, known as the Silver Dominion, was ruled by the Silverfang Pack. They were not the descendants of King Aldrich, but of the general who seized power after Aldrich's line mysteriously died out. Their power was maintained by 2 unwavering doctrines: rigid bloodline purity and the absolute utility of fear. At the bottom of this strict hierarchy were the Omegas, not the romanticized nurturers of some tales, but a permanent underclass. Orphans, the infirm, those with weak wolf spirits, they were considered societal drains, living reminders of weakness the pack could not abide. Ilara was the perfect picture of an Omega. Her parents, low-ranking scouts, vanished on a border patrol when she was 5. No bodies were recovered, which meant no honor in their death. She was left with nothing, not even a memory of their faces, just the faint scent of pine and frost she could barely recall. She was raised in the pack house's lower wards, a drafty stone annex where Omegas earned their keep through relentless labor. She mended clothes, scrubbed floors, and when she came of age, was assigned to the archives, dusting ledgers she was forbidden from reading. But Ilara had a secret. The dust she wiped away settled in her mind, forming patterns. She taught herself to read by tracing the old scripts with her fingers when no one was looking. She learned of pack lineages, trade routes, and the old laws. And in the most ancient, crumbling journal, she found a passing reference not to a curse, but to a covenant. A pact between the first king and the guardians of the deep wood, sealed not in conquest, but in mutual respect. The word betrayal was underlined, followed by a single, frantic sentence. The howls are not of anger, but of grief. We are the trespassers. She kept this knowledge locked tight inside her, a quiet, burning coal of doubt. It made her watchful. She saw how the Alpha, a man named Gideon, used the Shadowvale as his ultimate political tool. Dissenters, rivals who couldn't be openly executed, were given a chance at redemption by retrieving a mythical silver fern from the forest's edge. None ever returned. Their deaths were then used as proof of the forest's evil and the pack's righteous strength. The system was perfectly monstrous. Ilara's life was one of silent, careful observation, until the day of the Alpha's son, Kale, came of age. The solstice naming ceremony was a massive event where the future Alpha would formally receive his spirit name and, crucially, choose his first mate. The entire pack gathered in the Great Stone Hall. Ilara was there, of course, not as a guest, but as part of the serving detail, pouring wine for the high-ranked members. Kale Silverfang was everything the pack admired: tall, brutally strong, with a wolf spirit so dominant it made the air taste of metal. He had never once looked at Ilara, not truly. To him, she was part of the furniture. His eyes were on Lyra, daughter of the wealthy Eastern Border Alpha, a union that would secure crucial mining rights. The ceremony proceeded with ancient chants and the scent of burning sage. Then, the recognition happened. As Kale bit into the ceremonial stag's heart, a wave of primal energy pulsed through the hall. It was meant to connect him to his ancestral spirit, but the energy didn't just settle on him. It rippled outward, a seismic wave searching for a sympathetic resonance, and it found one in Ilara. A silent, invisible thread snapped taut between them. Ilara dropped the wine pitcher she was holding. It shattered on the flagstones, the sound like a gunshot in the sudden silence. Her own wolf spirit, a creature she had always felt as a faint, dormant shadow, surged to the surface with a force that stole her breath. It didn't howl in submission. It stood, alert and waiting. Every wolf in the hall felt the shift. The recognition, the fated mate bond, was supposed to be a rare and sacred blessing, a sign of the moon goddess's favor. It was never, ever supposed to happen between a future alpha and an omega. The taboo was so absolute, it was unthinkable. Kale whirled around, his face a mask of utter horror. He looked from Lyra's stunned, furious face to his father's, which had gone stone cold with lethal disapproval. The political alliance, his future, his very identity, all of it was crashing down because of a bond with a nobody, a servant, an omega. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Ilara, her heart hammering against her ribs, dared to look up. For a fleeting second, she saw not just horror in Kale's eyes, but a flicker of the bond's pull, a confusing, unwanted attraction. Then it was smothered by sheer revulsion. Alpha Gideon stood. His voice, when it came, was not loud. It was precise, and it cut through the room like a scalpel made of ice. An error, he stated. A residual spirit echo from the stag, nothing more. He was publicly, blatantly denying the moon goddess's own sign. The blasphemy was staggering, but his authority was absolute. The pack held its breath, willing it to be true. Kale seized the lifeline. He straightened his shoulders, his expression hardening into contempt. He looked directly at Ilara, his lip curling. An echo, he repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. My spirit would never recognize such refuse. The words were a physical blow. The nascent bond, so bright and shocking a moment ago, didn't just fade. It was violently crushed under the weight of his public rejection. A searing pain lanced through Ilara's chest, so intense she saw stars. A trickle of warmth dripped from her nose. Blood, the physical sign of a severed bond. But something else happened. As the pain crested, the dormant power within her, stirred by the bond's brief flash, didn't retreat in agony. It flared in defense. A low, subsonic pulse emanated from her, a vibration more felt than heard. The torch flames in the hall didn't flicker. They bent, stretching horizontally toward her for a single, impossible second before snapping back. No one else seemed to notice, their attention locked on Kale and the Alpha, all except one. Lysander, the pack, aged and scholarly beta, had been watching Ilara closely since the recognition. He saw the flames bend. His eyes widened in pure, unvarnished shock. He knew the old stories, the ones not found in the official histories. He knew what that sign meant, but before he could speak, Alpha Gideon's verdict rang out. The Omega, Gideon declared, his gaze settling on Ilara like a death sentence, has clearly been tainted by unstable, latent magic. A danger to herself and the pack's spiritual harmony. The Shadow Veil will cleanse what we cannot. A collective gasp, then a swift, approving murmur. It was the cleanest solution, politically perfect. It upheld the denial of the bond, removed the embarrassing witness, and reinforced the fear of the forest, all under the guise of merciful purification. Ilara was not given time to speak, to plead, to even understand the enormity of what had just been stolen from her and then imposed upon her. Two enforcers grabbed her arms. As they dragged her from the hall, her eyes met Lysander's. The old beater's face was a tragedy of fear and helplessness. He gave the faintest, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a warning, a farewell. They marched her through the sleeping kingdom, past the last outpost, to the very edge of the Shadow Veil. The forest loomed before her, a wall of impossible darkness. The air grew cold and still, the sounds of the pack disappearing as if swallowed. The enforcer shoved her forward, his touch cold with disgust. The forest welcomes its sacrifice, he muttered, before turning and sprinting back to safety. Ilara stood alone at the tree line. The pain of the rejection was a hollow ache in her chest, but it was being drowned out by a terrifying, profound silence from the woods. This was not the angry, roaring death she'd been promised. It was a watchful, ancient quiet. She took one shaky step forward, then another, the decaying leaves crunching under her bare feet. Behind her, she heard the distant, triumphant howls of the Silverfang pack, celebrating their future, and her demise. Before her, deep within the absolute dark, pairs of eyes ignited, not the yellow of ordinary wolves, but the luminous blue and silver of ancient starlight. They watched her. They did not advance. They did not attack. They waited. And as the first primordial wolf, a creature of shadow and shimmering pelt, slowly emerged from the gloom and lowered its massive head not to bite, but to sniff the air around her, Ilara realized the terrifying truth. The curse wasn't for her. It was for them. The first wolf did not attack. It bowed, and in that gesture, 3 centuries of lies began to unravel. The massive creature, its fur the color of a moonless night shot through with strands of shimmering silver, lowered its head until its muzzle touched the moss. The other pairs of glowing eyes emerged from the darkness, revealing a gathered assembly of perhaps 24 primordial wolves. Each was larger than any wolf Ilara had ever seen, moving with a silent, liquid grace that spoke of impossible age. They formed a loose circle around her, not a hunting formation, but one of observation, of assessment. A voice, deep and resonant as a stone chime, sounded not in her ears, but directly in her mind. You bear the scent of the breaking, the pain of the severed thread, but you also carry the echo of the promise. Who are you, child of the trespassers? Ilara staggered back, her heart hammering. She was speaking with a wolf. No, not speaking, being spoken to. The shock was so total it overrode her terror. I am no one, she whispered aloud, her voice cracking. An Omega, they threw me away. A wave of what felt like sorrow, vast and ancient, washed over her from the gathered wolves. They have thrown many away, the voice replied. They throw their own into our care, believing it punishment. They do not understand they are returning stolen things to their rightful guardians. The wolf before her lifted its head. My name is Fenrir. I am the memory keeper of this wood. And you are not no one. You are the first in 10 generations to walk in here with the mark of the covenant stirring in your blood. The mark of the covenant. The words from the ancient journal flashed in her mind. Before she could process it, Fenrir turned and began to pad silently deeper into the forest. He paused, looking back. Come, the truth of roots awaits you. It is time you learned why your people fear the dark. What choice did she have? Ilara followed. The Shadowvale was not a forest of death, but a forest of memory. As Fenrir led her along hidden paths, the very air changed. The oppressive fear she'd felt at the border melted away, replaced by a profound, thrumming vitality. Bioluminescent fungi clung to giant trees, casting a soft blue light. Ancient stones, carved with intricate wolf and moon motifs, stood half swallowed by roots. This was not a cursed place. It was a sacred one, fallen into ruin and misunderstanding. They arrived at the heart of the forest, a clearing dominated by a massive, petrified tree, its branches like claws scraping the sky. Around its base lay skeletons, not of wolves, but of humans and werewolves, still clad in rusted armor from centuries past. These were not recent victims. These were the remains of the army of King Aldrich, the ones who had tried to enslave the Guardians. Fenrir sat before the great tree. This is the truth of roots. Touch it and see the story they erased. Hesitantly, Ilara placed her palm on the cold, rough bark. A vision exploded behind her eyes, not a dream, but a memory of the land itself. She saw not a betrayal by the wolves, but by the king. She saw the first guardians, wolves of spirit and starlight, the original inhabitants of this land, forming a covenant with a young, ambitious chieftain named Aldrich. They would grant his people protection and a connection to the land's deep magic. In return, his line would act as stewards, protect the forests, and rule with a balance of strength and compassion. The sign of this covenant was a unique spark in the soul, a true heart that would manifest in Aldrich's bloodline. It was this spark the Guardians could recognize. Then she saw Aldrich's greed. With the kingdom secured, he saw the Guardians not as partners, but as tools to be controlled. He ordered his mages to forge collars of black iron, designed to bind their spirits to his will. The night he attempted to enact his plan, the betrayal shattered the covenant. The magic recoiled. In the ensuing battle, Aldrich and his direct heirs were not killed by wolf fangs, but consumed by the backfire of their own binding spells, their souls ripped apart by the broken promise. The surviving nobles, led by Aldrich's general, saw a different opportunity. They couldn't control the Guardians, so they would demonize them. They fabricated the curse, painting the Guardians as vengeful monsters. They declared that any Omega, a term they now defined as those with weak or impure wolf spirits, was inherently tainted by the forest's malice and would be killed on sight. It was a brilliant, horrific strategy. It created a permanent underclass to blame for misfortune, justified the expansion of their power by holding back the evil forest, and most crucially, it provided a perfect, untraceable method of execution for anyone who threatened their new order. The forest didn't kill the Omegas thrown into it. The Guardians, bound by the original Covenant's magic to assess any of the Steward's bloodline who entered, examined them. They searched for the true heart, the spark of the original promise. For 300 years, every exile, every political rival, every inconvenient heir, every useless Omega had been found wanting. They carried the blood of the traitor general, not the true king. They carried fear, greed, arrogance. So the Guardians, in their grief and duty, did not welcome them. They gave them the mercy of a swift end. Their deaths then used to reinforce the lie. Ilara ripped her hand from the tree, gasping. The truth was a physical weight in her chest. The entire foundation of her world, of her identity as a worthless Omega, was a fabricated nightmare. You see, Fenrir's voice came, gentle now. You felt the recognition with the Silverfang boy because the bond magic sought its own. It is weak in his line, diluted by generations of tyranny, but in you it screamed. When he rejected you, when he shattered that sacred thread, it did not destroy the spark. It ignited it. We felt its flare at the forest's edge. That is why we did not kill you. You are not of the trespasser's blood, you are of the true steward's line. A descendant of Aldrich, hidden in the Omega, ranks all this time. That's impossible, Ilara breathed. My parents were scouts, nobodies. Were they? Fenrir asked. What do you truly remember? The memory she clung to, the scent of pine and frost on her parents, suddenly sharpened, not from a border patrol, but from a hidden cabin deep in the woods, far from packed lands. A lullaby her mother sang, an old tune about moon and stone. Fragments of conversation whispered, we must hide her spark, the Alpha's seekers, only in plain sight. Her parents hadn't been random scouts. They were descendants of the true line in hiding. They'd been discovered and killed, not by rogues, but by Alpha Gideon's agents. She was orphaned not by chance, but by a purge she never knew was happening. And she had been left in the most brilliant hiding place imaginable, the visible, despised Omega class, where no one would ever think to look for a royal heir. The revelation was a tempest, grief, rage, and a terrifying sense of purpose. For 3 days the Guardians taught her. They showed her how the forest worked, how its roots were tied to the kingdom's health, and how the Silverfang Pack's rule was slowly poisoning both. They showed her the army the outside world feared, not a military force, but the forest itself. The trees that could shift paths, the wolves that could move like shadows, the very earth that could remember. Fenrir explained the final piece. The Covenant magic is a balance. For 300 years, it has been unbalanced, held in stasis by the lie. Your recognition and violent rejection was the crack. Your survival here is the breach. The land is waking, and it will either heal with you as its steward, or it will purge the infection of the trespassers. The choice will come. On the morning of the 3rd day, Fenrir led her to the forest's edge. The entire assembly of primordial wolves followed. The time for hiding is over, daughter of the promise. You must walk back into their world. They will see us at your back and know their fear has a new shape. What happens next will be written by your will. Meanwhile, back in the Silver Dominion, a different story was being told. Ilara's survival was impossible, so no one believed it. The scout who patrolled the forest's edge claimed he saw a figure in a torn grey dress moving within the trees, followed by shifting, gigantic shadows. He was ridiculed, accused of drinking on duty. The official report stated Ilara was dead, consumed by the curse. Life moved on. Kale's engagement to Lyra was formally announced. The pack celebrated. But in the quiet of the archives, Beta Lysander knew. He had seen the flame bend. He had studied the forbidden texts. He pieced together the scout's hysterical report with the ancient descriptions of the Guardians. A cold, certain dread settled in his stomach. The Omega hadn't just survived. She had been chosen, and if the Guardians were moving with her, it meant only one thing: the Covenant was asserting itself. The kingdom was sitting on a powder keg, and Alpha Gideon, was about to throw a lit torch on it. He went to Gideon, not in the public hall, but in his private war room. "My Alpha," Lysander said, his voice low, "the girl in the forest, the scout may not be lying." Gideon scoffed, examining a map of proposed mining expansions. "The forest kills, it's what it does. The matter is closed." "With respect," Lysander pressed, "the old Thales speak of the Guardians recognizing the true heart. If by some astronomical chance she possesses a trace of the old blood, and they have accepted her, then every execution we've performed using the forest is revealed as murder. Our authority, the very story we rule by, collapses." For the first time, Gideon looked up, his eyes narrowing. The political calculation was instant. The truth was irrelevant. Perception was everything. If the pack even believed the Omega lived, the foundation of fear crumbled. "Then we must ensure the pack sees her corpse," Gideon stated, his voice ice. "Send Kale, take 5 of his best enforcers, have them find her remains and bring them back, publicly. If they see anything else, wolves, spirits, anything, they are to kill it and say it was guarding her bones. The forest is a beast. We are the hunters. That is the only story." It was a fatal misjudgment. Gideon was sending his son, the one who had rejected the bond, to confront the living symbol of that mistake, guarded by the very forces the kingdom was built upon denying. Kale, eager to prove his strength and bury his lingering unease about the recognition, took the task with grim relish. He selected his men, armed them with silver-tipped spears and torches, and marched to the forest's edge as the sun began to set on the third day. They stood where Elara had been thrown in, the enforcers uneasy, the forest darker and quieter than ever. "We go in, we find the body, we get out," Kale ordered, his voice betraying a hint of strain. "Nothing else matters." They had taken 10 steps into the gloom when the temperature dropped. The torches, which had burned brightly, suddenly guttered as if choked, and from the darkness ahead, a figure emerged. It was Elara. Her grey dress was torn and stained with moss, her feet bare and dirty, but she stood straight, her chin lifted. Her eyes, which had always been downcast, now held a calm, piercing light. She looked not like a hunted creature, but like someone who had come home. Behind her, the darkness solidified into forms, massive, sleek shapes with eyes of blue and silver flame. The primordial wolves, silent and countless, flanking her in a V formation that was unmistakably deliberate, unmistakably loyal. Kale and his enforcers froze, their blood turning to ice. The sight broke every law of their world. The curse was passive, a trap. This was active. This was allegiance. "You're supposed to be dead," Kale whispered, the words a dry rasp. Elara looked at him, the boy who had shattered her in front of hundreds. She felt no anger, only a vast, sorrowful pity. "No, Kale," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the silent wood. "I was supposed to be forgotten, but some truths are too heavy to stay buried." One of the enforcers, mad with fear, raised his silver spear and hurled it at her. The weapon never reached its target. A silver-furred wolf, moving faster than sight, intercepted it midair, batting it aside with a casual swipe of a paw that shattered the shaft. The wolf didn't growl. It just stared, its gaze promising an end more final than any spear. The message was clear. She was under their protection. Kale, his alpha pride warring with primal terror, took a step forward. "You are an Omega. You will come back with us now, or we will drag you." Elara actually smiled, a small, sad thing. "I am not an Omega, Kale. I am the last steward. And this," she said, gesturing to the wolves, to the ancient trees, "this is my kingdom. You are the trespassers here. You have 5 minutes to leave this wood. After that, the Guardians will escort you out." She didn't wait for his response. She simply turned and walked back into the deep forest, the wolves flowing around her like a living shadow before melting back into the trees, leaving Kale and his men alone in the sudden, terrifying silence. They ran like men who had seen the world turn inside out. Kale burst into his father's war room, his face pale, his composure shattered. "She's alive, the wolves, they're with her, they obey her." Alpha Gideon stared at his son, the report from the terrified enforcers confirming the impossible. The carefully constructed lie of 3 centuries was unraveling in real time, and it had a name: Ilara. In that moment, Gideon made his second fatal decision. He would not contain the story. He would weaponize it. He called for the pack crier. "Announce this," he commanded, his voice booming with fabricated outrage. "The Omega Ilara has consorted with the cursed beasts of the Shadow Vale. She has used dark magic to survive and now leads an army of monsters against her own people. She is no longer a banished criminal. She is a declared enemy of the pack, a witch and a traitor. Any who see her are to kill her on sight." The announcement was a masterstroke of propaganda. It reframed her survival not as a divine challenge to his rule, but as a demonic betrayal. It gave the pack a new, tangible enemy to fear and hate. It united them against the external threat he created. But high in his tower, Beta Lysander heard the proclamation and closed his eyes in despair. Gideon had just declared war on the forest itself, and from what Lysander had seen in Ilara's eyes at the ceremony and what the scouts now described, the forest had finally found a queen to lead its defense. The powder keg was lit, the fuse was burning, and Ilara, standing beneath the petrified truth of roots, felt the land's anger stir in response to Gideon's words. The choice Fenrir spoke of was being made for her. War was coming, and she would have to decide whether to reclaim her throne or watch the forest do what it had waited 3 centuries to do: cleanse the trespassers once and for all. Gideon's declaration of war didn't just target Ilara, it was a kill switch for the truth, and his first move wasn't an army, it was to poison the only thing that could prove her right: history itself. Before dawn the next day, Alpha Gideon's enforcers raided the archives. Under the guise of protecting sacred texts from potential dark magic, they removed every single ancient journal, every crumbling scroll, every genealogical record older than 200 years. Beta Lysander was forced to stand by and watch as the physical evidence of the Covenant was loaded onto a cart and taken to the Alpha's private tower. By noon, a column of black smoke rose from the castle's highest chimney. They weren't securing the past, they were burning it. Lysander, his life's work turning to ash on the wind, finally broke. That night, under the cover of a moonless sky, he did the unthinkable. He stole a horse and rode for the Shadow Vale. He was an old man, a scholar, not a warrior. The forest terrified him, but the thought of living in a world where the last shred of truth had been erased terrified him more. He reached the tree line and, trembling, called out Ilara's name into the silent dark. He expected to be torn apart. Instead, a single primordial wolf, smaller than Fenrir but with wise, amber eyes, emerged. It studied him, then turned, leading him deep into the woods. He was brought not to the truth of roots, but to a sheltered grove where Ilara sat with Fenrir. She looked at the terrified, ash-smudged Beta, and there was no triumph in her eyes, only a deep sadness. "You burned them," she said, not as an accusation, but a statement of grief. "He did," Lysander gasped, falling to his knees. "All of them. The journal you found, the Covenant scroll, the true lineage records, gone. He is rewriting history in real time. The next generation will never know anything but his lie." This was the true escalation. Gideon wasn't just fighting a girl with wolves. He was fighting memory. He was ensuring that even if Ilara won a battle, she would lose the war for the kingdom's soul. There would be no proof, no context for her claim. She would just be a powerful witch who conquered with monsters. Fenrir's voice hummed in the grove. "The trespasser seeks to unmake the past, but the land remembers what paper forgets. The roots remember, the stones remember." "The people don't listen to stones," Ilara said, her voice hardening with a new steely resolve. "They listen to power, and they listen to survival." She looked at Lysander. "You know the pack's heart, its weaknesses, not just its soldiers but its people. The Omegas in the lower wards, the farmers whose crops fail because the land is sick, the guards who are tired of brutality. Tell me." And so the exiled Omega and the deposed scholar began to plan a war, not with the forest's army, but with its truth. Lysander revealed the pack's fragile infrastructure: the granaries, the single ancient aqueduct that brought water from a spring near the forest, the network of informants Gideon used to control dissent. Ilara, in turn, listened to the forest. Through Fenrir, she learned the land's pain points, where the Silverfangs mining was causing slow poisoning, where their clear-cutting was making the earth unstable. But Gideon was not idle. With the past erased, he moved to control the present. He summoned his captains. "The witch hides in the wood, so we will burn her out," he declared. He ordered the forest's edge to be set ablaze along a half-mile stretch. It was a test, a brutal ecological test to see if the forest's magic could stop human-made fire. The torches were thrown, the dry undergrowth caught. Flames roared skyward, a wall of orange heat and black smoke advancing into the shadow veil. Inside the forest, Ilara felt it, a searing pain across her senses as if her own skin were burning. The wolves howled, a sound of rage and anguish. But then something miraculous happened. The ancient trees at the very front, their bark glowing with silver runes only Ilara could now see, released a thick, rushing sap that smothered the flames with a hissing steam. Vines as thick as a man's arm shot from the ground, coiling around burning logs and strangling the fire. The wind, which had been blowing toward the forest, suddenly reversed, pushing the smoke and heat back into the faces of the pack soldiers. The fire lasted 20 minutes. It left a scar, but it did not breach the wood. The message was clear. The forest itself was a conscious defender. You could not simply burn it. Gideon saw this not as a defeat, but as a new weapon. "See," he roared to his gathered pack, "the forest fights for her. It is a demonic entity, and she is its priestess. We are not fighting a girl. We are fighting the curse made flesh." He doubled down. He imposed a war tax, conscripted every able-bodied wolf, and spread a new, more insidious rumor that Ilara's magic fed on the strength of the pack, that every Omega who sympathized with her was a siphon stealing vitality from true wolves to empower the forest. It was a masterstroke of paranoid propaganda. It turned the pack inward, sparking witch hunts and purges within the lower wards. Omegas were rounded up, interrogated, and imprisoned not for anything they did, but for what they might be thinking. This was the wait, it gets worse moment. Ilara's very existence was now causing the suffering of the people she wanted to save. Every day she stayed in the forest, Gideon tightened his grip, using her as the perfect external enemy to justify internal terror. She had to act, but how? A direct assault was impossible. The pack's fortress was strong, and her guardians, while powerful, were not siege engines. They were protectors. Then Lysander gave her the key. "The aqueduct," he said, pointing to a map he'd drawn from memory. "Its source is a spring deep in the northern part of the Shadow Vale here. The pipe runs above ground for the last mile into the citadel. It is the pack's only source of clean water. Gideon thinks it's safe because it's outside the cursed part of the wood. He doesn't understand the forest is one entity." A plan, cold and clear, formed in Ilara's mind. She wouldn't attack the pack. She would demonstrate their dependence on the land they despised. She would show them the forest didn't just kill, it gave life, and it could take it away. Under the next new moon, Ilara, Fenrir, and a small group of wolves that moved like mist traveled to the springhead. It was a beautiful, clear pool fed from deep underground, untouched by the Silverfang's corruption. With Fenrir's guidance, Ilara placed her hands in the water and reached out with the new, unfamiliar sense of the Covenant magic inside her. She didn't poison it. She asked it to sleep, to go quiet. The next morning, the aqueduct ran dry, not a trickle dust. Panic erupted in the citadel. No water for the kitchens, the baths, the animals. The well inside the walls was brackish and limited. Gideon was furious, blaming saboteurs and executing 2 Omegas in the public square. But the truth was a silent, invisible strike, a siege no army could maintain. Ilara sent a message, not written but delivered. She had the wolves guide a lone, terrified pack messenger, a young beater who had gotten lost on patrol to the now dry spring. Lying on a flat stone was a single, perfect silver fern, the very mythical plant Gideon had sent so many to die trying to find. Beside it, a message carved into the stone by a wolf's claw: "The water returns when the stealing stops. The land speaks through the steward. Listen." It was an offer, a chance for a peaceful resolution, a demonstration of power without slaughter. It backfired catastrophically. Gideon didn't see a peace offer, he saw a vulnerability. The witch cared about the land. She wouldn't poison it. She was soft. He called his son, Kale, whose humiliation had festered into a bitter, obsessive need for redemption. She controls the water, Gideon said. So we take the spring, not with fire but with iron and salt. We march a full battalion with mages. We fortify the spring head, claim it in the name of the pack, and salt the earth so nothing grows. We show her that anything she can do, we can defile forever. It was a move of such profound, spiteful destruction that even some of his captains balked. But Gideon's will was iron. Chaol, eager for command and vengeance, took charge. Ilara, through the forest's awareness, felt the battalion gathering at the northern border. She felt their intent not to fight her, but to murder the land itself. Fenrir growled, a sound of impending cataclysm. The Covenant allows defense. It allows cleansing. It is balancing. What they plan is an abomination. The land will not endure it. It will answer with a fury that cannot be controlled. What does that mean? Ilara asked, a chill running down her spine. It means, Fenrir said, his starlit eyes grave, if they pour their poison into the heart spring, the forest will not just kill them. It will reject the entire area. The earth will sour for miles. The blight will spread. It will not stop at their walls. It will kill every living thing in its path until the poison is purged, even if that means the kingdom itself becomes a wasteland. This is the purge I warned you of. The choice is now. Stop them with your will and your wolves. Or let the land's vengeance burn everything, including any innocent left in its wake. The stakes had just snapped into horrifying focus. This was no longer about reclaiming a throne or proving a point. Gideon, in his reckless pride, was about to trigger an apocalyptic ecological backlash. Ilara couldn't just defend anymore. She couldn't wait. She had to attack. She had to stop Chaol's battalion before they reached the spring, not to start a war, but to prevent an extinction-level event. She looked at the assembled guardians, their eyes glowing in the gloom. She thought of the Omegas in Gideon's dungeons, of the poisoned land, of the truth turned to ash. The time for subtlety was over. Fenrir, she said, her voice no longer that of a girl, but of a steward making her first true command. Gather the guardians, all of them. We do not wait for them at the spring. We meet them in the woods, and we do not just stop them. She picked up a stout branch, feeling the weight of it, a symbol of the authority she never asked for. We show the Silver Dominion what happens when the forest finally decides to hunt. As the primordial wolves melted from the shadows around her, forming a silent, deadly legion, Ilara took her first step onto the path that led not deeper into the woods, but out, toward the army, toward the citadel, toward the man who had made her an orphan and a prisoner. The reclaimed queen was coming, and she was bringing the wrath of the rooted world with her. The battle for the spring was not a clash of armies, but a lesson in terror. Chaol's battalion of 50 hardened warriors marched into a forest that had decided to stop being a place and start being a predator. Ilara did not meet them head-on. She let them in. The guardians became the forest itself. A soldier would step on what looked like solid ground, only for roots to snap around his ankle and yank him beneath the leaf litter, silencing his scream in seconds. Arrows fired at shifting shadows would be caught midair by snapping branches. The very light played tricks, creating phantom howls from all directions while the real wolves moved in utter silence. Chaol, at the center of his crumbling formation, shouted orders that were swallowed by the oppressive quiet. He saw his men vanish one by one, not in glorious combat, but erased. This wasn't war. It was a culling, panic-dissolved discipline. The battalion broke, men scattering into the deeper gloom, only to be picked off more easily. Ilara found Chaol alone, backed against the massive, silvery bark of an ancient willow beside the sleeping spring. He held a vial of black salt in one trembling hand, a torch in the other. His eyes were wide with a terror that had finally scraped away all his alpha arrogance. "Stay back," he screamed, his voice cracking. "I'll poison it, I'll do it." "You could try," Ilara said, stepping from behind a tree. Fenrir materialized at her side, a low growl rumbling that made the earth vibrate. "But the spring is already asleep. Your salt would just lie on the stone. And then," she added, her gaze cold, "Fenrir would be very disappointed, and he hasn't eaten today." Chaol looked from her to the monstrous wolf, then at the useless vial in his hand. The absurdity of it all, the burned histories, the fabricated curse, his father's grand war collapsed on him. He was a boy with a bottle of dirt, threatening a goddess and a legend. His hand opened. The vial dropped, shattering on the rock, the harmless salt scattering. He sank to his knees, not in submission to her, but in utter defeat. "What are you?" he whispered. "I am what your family spent 300 years trying to erase," Ilara said. "The truth has teeth, Kale, and you're looking at them." She didn't order his death. She simply turned. "Take him, bind him, he will see the end of his father's lie." With the battalion captured or fled, the path to the citadel was open. But Ilara did not lead a vengeful charge. She walked, with Fenrir and the main host of guardians a visible, awe-inspiring force behind her. But ahead of her, she sent a different message. The wolves guided the freed Omegas from the lower wards, the farmers whose fields were failing, the families of the soldiers who hadn't returned from the forest, all those who had suffered under Gideon's rule. They streamed out of the city gates, not as combatants, but as witnesses. They lined the road, watching the forest-born queen and her legendary protectors approach. It was a procession of legitimacy. The people saw the primordial wolves, creatures of myth, walking calmly beside a young woman in a torn grey dress. They did not see rage. They saw serene, terrifying power, and they saw their own exiled and oppressed walking freely with her. The propaganda of the demon witch evaporated in the face of this quiet, majestic reality. Alpha Gideon stood on the citadel battlements, watching his kingdom drain away out the gates. His enforcers, seeing the tide turn and fearing the wolves more than they feared him, dropped their weapons and melted into the crowd. He was left with only a handful of fanatical loyalists barricaded in the great hall. Ilara walked through the open gates, up the main thoroughfare, and into the pack house for the first time not as a servant, but as a claimant. The great oak doors were sealed. She did not command the wolves to break them. She placed her hand on the wood, reached for the covenant magic within her and the land, and asked the ancient timbers, cut from the Shadowvale centuries ago, to remember their roots. The doors didn't splinter. They sighed. They unknotted, grain flowing like water, and simply opened. Inside, Gideon stood before the Alpha's throne, a ceremonial sword in his hand, his face a grotesque mask of fury and denial. "You bring monsters into our home," he spat. "I bring the landlords," Ilara corrected, her voice echoing in the silent hall. "You are the monster who forgot he was a guest." She walked toward him, Fenrir at her heel. The few remaining loyalists shrank back, the primal fear of the Guardian overwhelming their training. "The curse is real," Gideon screamed, desperate. "It kills." "It judges," Ilara said, stopping a dozen feet from him, "and it found you and every Alpha before you guilty. Guilty of betrayal, guilty of murder, guilty of stealing a kingdom and calling it inheritance." She looked past him to the throne. "That was never yours to sit on. It was a steward's seat for one who would listen to the land. You only ever heard your own greed." Gideon, in a final, futile act of defiance, raised his sword and charged. He didn't make it 3 steps. Fenrir moved, a blur of night. He didn't rip out Gideon's throat. He simply swiped a massive paw, batting the sword away as if it were a toy, then placed that same paw on Gideon's chest, pinning the Alpha to the stone floor with crushing, immovable weight. There was no violence, just absolute, effortless control. Ilara walked to the throne. She did not sit. She turned and faced the hall, now filling with her people, with Lysander, with the awestruck pack members. "The Silverfang rule ends today," she declared, her voice ringing with a finality that felt woven into the world itself. "The lie ends today. The covenant is broken no longer." She then gave her first true orders as the last steward. Alpha Gideon and his son Kale were not executed. They were given the sentence they had inflicted on so many others. Stripped of their ranks, their pack marks magically severed by a touch from Fenrir, a painless but profound spiritual amputation, they were exiled. Not into the Shadowvale, but into the wider human world beyond the mountains, to live as the true nobodies they had always feared becoming. The Omegas were freed, their classification abolished. The land's stewardship became the new law. Mining and logging would be negotiated with the forest guardians, not taken. The truth of roots was brought from the forest, a living sapling from the petrified tree, and planted in the citadel courtyard, a permanent, growing testament to the real history. Ilara's coronation was not a pact ceremony, but a covenant reaffirmation. It happened at the border of the Shadowvale under the full moon. There was no crown of gold, but a wreath of living silver fern and moonlit vines. Fenrir, speaking for all the guardians, restated the ancient vows. Ilara, in turn, pledged her life to the balance. The primordial wolves bowed as one. Then, the forest itself seemed to sigh, a wave of vitality rushing outwards. The next morning, flowers bloomed in the salted fields. The aqueduct flowed with clear, cold water. The land began to heal, and with it, the people. But here is the final, surprising detail. In the weeks that followed, as a new council was formed and the kingdom, now called the Covenant Lands, found its footing, Ilara felt a familiar, faint pulse. The severed mate bond with Kale, a thread she thought dead, still had a ghostly echo, but it wasn't tied to Kale anymore. The bond's magic, it seemed, had recognized the true heart in her, but attached itself to the wrong person in the chaos of the ceremony. Now purified by the covenant magic and her own transformation, the bond was searching. Fenrir confirmed it. The mate bond of a true steward was not a trivial thing. It would find its true match, not based on politics or power, but on a soul that could balance the stewardship of an entire living kingdom. It was still out there, waiting. Ilara stood on her balcony, looking at the thriving Shadowvale, no longer a border of fear but the heart of her realm. She was queen, she was steward, she had an army of ancient wolves and an awakened land. And somewhere, a thread of destiny was still winding its way toward her, promising that her story and the kingdom was far from over. The rejected Omega had not just conquered, she had transformed the very definition of power. And as the first true leader in 3 centuries, she knew the hardest work, the healing, was just beginning. Ilara's journey from discarded Omega to sovereign steward is a myth, a power fantasy spun from moonlight and ancient magic. But the core of her story, the transformation of profound rejection into unshakable strength, echoes a very real human truth. Psychologically, social rejection is processed in the brain as physical pain. It triggers a primal threat response, because for most of human history, exile from the group meant death. The pack that threw Ilara away was acting on that same brutal instinct, purge the perceived weakness to protect the whole. But what happens when the exile doesn't die? What happens when, instead of crumbling, they find a deeper, more ancient source of belonging? This is the redemptive narrative in its purest form. Studies show that people who frame their life stories as journeys from suffering to growth, from contamination to redemption, report higher levels of well-being, life satisfaction, and generativity, that desire to build and nurture for the future. Ilara didn't just seek revenge, she rebuilt a broken system. She moved from being the target of a lie to becoming the steward of a forgotten truth. Her power didn't come from dominating others, but from understanding a balance far older than any alpha's command. And what of the legendary wolf pack itself? The myth of the alpha wolf, the all-powerful leader who rules through force, was debunked decades ago by biologists like L. David Mech, who found that wild packs are simply families led by parents. The real power isn't in solo dominance, but in cooperative care. Isn't that what Ilara ultimately built? Not a hierarchy of fear, but a covenant of mutual care between people and land, supported by the primal family of the Guardians. The fantasy corrects the myth, replacing violent domination with protective alliance. Ilara's story resonates because it takes the universal sting of rejection, that feeling of being deemed not good enough, of being thrown away, and flips it. It asks, what if the place that casts you out isn't the whole world? What if there's an older, wilder truth waiting to recognize a value that polite society is blind to? Her army wasn't conquered. It was earned through respect for a power that had been waiting, patient and furious, for someone worthy to listen. So the next time you face a moment of exclusion, a dismissal that tries to define your worth, remember the Shadowvale. Remember that sometimes the forest that everyone warns you about isn't your tomb. It might be your awakening. The most terrifying power isn't the kind that pushes others down. It's the kind that rises from the roots, heals the poisoned ground, and knows that true leadership isn't about being followed, but about belonging to something greater than yourself. If this tale of transformative power and mythic justice spoke to you, do me a huge favor. Hit that like button, it truly helps the channel. Share this with someone who needs a reminder of their own hidden strength. And subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss our next deep dive into the stories that shape us, both in fantasy and in the fascinating truths of our own world. Let me know in the comments, What part of Ilara's transformation resonated most deeply with you? Until next time.